This one? Okay, I think we're ready to begin. Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to introduce a very good, can you hear me? Is this okay, Theo? Yeah? A very good and old friend, Michael Sorkin, who is just flown in from New York. And Michael was appointed a visiting professor of architecture in this faculty in 2013. It's taken us quite a while to get you here for your inaugural lecture, but finally we've done it. So thank you very much for being here. Okay, Michael Sorkin probably needs no introduction, but he is an American architect, architectural critic, and author, so Wikipedia tells us, of several hundred articles, which must be I can believe it, actually, in a range of academic, professional, and general publications. He is Distinguished Professor of Architecture and Director of the Graduate Program in Urban Design at the Bernard and Ann Spitzer School of Architecture at the City College of New York. And he is also principal of Michael Sorkin Studio, a design practice devoted to both practical and theoretical projects at all scales, with a special interest in sustainable urban environments and green city architecture. Coupled to this, Michael founded Terraform in 2005, which is an independent research and advocacy center to investigate the forms, policies, technologies, and practices that will yield equitable, sustainable, and beautiful cities for our urbanizing planet. And I'm hoping he's going to show us some examples of that this evening. Thank you.
Indeed. I'm visiting professor, and this is my visit, huh? Actually, my name is Norman Foster. If you're looking for Sorkin, he's at the LSE tonight, I think. Anyway, thank you. Delighted to be visiting. There's a troubling asymmetry in the disposition of this podium in relationship to the room and to the... Hi, Liz. So, good evening. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to confine this lecture to a single Coca-Cola, but no promises. Let me just see if this thing works. City-states. Does any rational person really dispute that the planet's in deep shit? Global urban population is increasing by over 1 million a week. More than half already live in cities, expected to hit 3/4 by mid-century. Half of these are in slums, and the gap between rich and poor grows ever greater. Default solutions, megacities, sprawl, mass migration, and promiscuous location are all nightmares. Cities too big are ungovernable, alienating, threatening, wasteful, unsustainable. Market-driven, bottom-line locational choices promote global social disruption and insecurity as jobs chase low wages and our urbanity pursues privilege for the so-called creative class. And the planet simply cannot keep up with our rates of consumption and waste. Last year, 1.5 million Chinese died from air pollution. 1 billion people can't get a clean glass of water. 1 in 9 is starving. But we all pay the price. The acid in the pristine lakes of Norway is gassed out by coal plants in Hebei. And the breeze from Fukushima irradiates us all. As the ice caps melt and the seas rise, they will not simply submerge the subsistence farmers of Bangladesh, but will also wash out the high rollers in Singapore and Miami Beach. We each know, I think, some version of this grim truth. If everyone had the ecological footprint of the average American or Brit, the land area needed to provision us, we'd need 4 planets right now in order to survive. These are not simply urban problems, but cities are distillation machines. They concentrate. If we architects and urbanists have the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath, it's this: a pledge to create places that are sustainable, equitable, and beautiful. But how? To begin, we must continuously negotiate our role and our relevance. Despite our dreams, we are not the hegemons of the urban and must be wary of top-down fantasies and of too easily confusing form and effect. Political power seldom actually comes our way, and Haussmann, Speer, or Moses must be renounced as models of practice. The ultimate right to the city and its form belongs to its citizens. Well, this is a nice theory, but somewhat thornier a practice, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that we professionals are invariably subordinate. We lay down vital armatures, create the economic, intellectual, analytical, and physical circumstances for the project of the city, and must do so at a magnitude commensurate with the question and the crisis. That our collaboration is contingent and constantly shifting shouldn't obscure what we do, nor its vital basis in consent. Real planning must come from the unending dialectic of top-down and bottom-up. But we face an even more dramatic risk. The city is simply disappearing. As the actual project of urbanization takes the form of the repetitive construction of massive but commonplace infrastructures, thousands of identical apartment towers, skyscraper-clotted central business districts, giant highways, airport-free zones, we identify the city with another kind of territoriality, the ubiquitous ooze that is the characteristic spatial product of neoliberal multinationalism and its global zoning, a phenomenon that not simply ratchets up and conceals the idea of centralized planning, but militates for a dreadful uniformity of place, one that threatens the freedom and the individuality of all of us. These phenomena, including the megacities that aggregate them, are precisely not cities. And we must hold the line against either purely operational notions of what constitutes urbanity, the city is no more than the sum of its infrastructures, and insist that both the expressive and the social, the democratic possibilities of urban space are at the core of what distinguishes the idea of the city and its practices. And we must be especially wary of the seductions of the smart city and its focus on strategies of surveillance and control rather than on the means of citizen empowerment and on environmental and cultural sustainability. The city seen as the ground for participation suggests another model with a powerful grip on the urban imaginary: informality, the dominant urbanism of cities in the so-called developing world. Informality purges planning from the charge of domination by foregrounding self-help and participation. Can we use its methods? The question locates central issues of urban politics and empowerment, but we too often have romanticized one-dimensional relationships to these places, whether based on their visual complexity, cubist compositions tumbling down the hillsides of Rio or Bogota, or on some fantasy of the liberated lives of their inhabitants. Today's do-it-yourself and tactical urbanisms are attempts to reinvigorate community control in our own cities and to gain purchase in an environment in which that damn 1% holds all the cards, to advance a kind of active collective intelligence that's very different from the centralized brain of the smart city. How can we reconcile the actual misery of squatter settlements with their communal dynamics, technical ingenuity, self-initiation, economic creativity, tight bonds of necessity, and open-ended formal invention without ratifying the end product? Our ambition should not be to reproduce Dharavi or Soweto as a final state, nor to assume that a permanent, if dynamic, condition of organized squalor is the best we can do for the city. The risks of relativism here are too great and the results ultimately too meager. There's an image that's been making the rounds of late, the squatter occupation of the abandoned Torre David in Caracas, that is alternately interpreted as a self-enfranchising utopia or as a J.G. Ballard high-rise nightmare. This spectacle stands in the highly ambiguous place once occupied by the famous walled city of Kowloon. Insane in its density, romantically outlaw a desperate, filthy riposte to the shiny, sunlit hygiene of repudiated modernist urbanism, as well as a kind of nasty Orientalist summa of the libertine degradation of the other. While there is something inspiring about this, it's simply not the answer. There have to be choices between the heroic yet squalid insubordination of the now displaced heroes of the Torre David and the unelected misery of the slums. Simple normalization is not the solution, and I'm hardly the first to argue that the answer may not to be draw squatters deeper and deeper into the system, a la Hernando de Soto, by miring them in credit, bank cards, land titles, and the disabling appliances of capital that further ratify their apartheid, but surely critical that we do something. This begins, I think, with recognizing that a purely informal sector doesn't actually exist. Formality and informality are both conceptual ghettos, taking shape in the imaginary to reinforce and reify a set of practices with ever-shifting uses. The lives actually led in these settlements almost always combine survival strategies that cross between these illusory sectors all the time, in the way people find and build housing, receive their educations, earn their living, take their pleasures. And it is to these complex negotiations that we must look. Whatever genuinely advances freedom and opportunity is a tool, a tactic worth wielding. A key question raised by the patterns of megacities and of informality is density. And distributing density at planetary, regional, and urban scales is one of our core challenges. Today, density is being revisited under our reshaped sensibility of sustainability. And from this perspective, it's clear that too little density can be as problematic as too much. The downsides of the sparse suburbia that continues to be the main pattern for the growth of U.S. cities and the embodiment of the American dream include infrastructure costs greatly exaggerated by distance, total dependency on private cars, thwarting of the material and thermal efficiencies of compact design, and a hyper-privatization that precludes a legion of public possibilities. There's a phrase used by those seeking affordable suburban housing in the U.S., drive until you qualify. This encapsulates the dilemma of someone with a fixed amount of credit who must travel further and further towards the urban periphery to find a home she can actually finance. The result may be the purchase of that fantasy of house and yard, but the cost can be a commuting time of 6 or even 8 hours a day. This kind of uncontrolled growth of both slums and suburbs has to be confronted head on. Istanbul, third fastest growing city in the world, expands voraciously in every direction, dominating the national economy and remaining too attractive for its own good. Likewise, because of the lure of jobs and possibilities, impossible Mumbai grows at twice the rate of Maharashtra, its surrounding state, and at 2.5 times the rate of India as a whole. In China, the authorities have declared Beijing a super city with a population of 150 million people, a single city with as many inhabitants as the whole of the United States had in 1950. Is this wise regionalism or simply centralization run completely amok? But even these enormous numbers don't tell the whole story. I've just come back from Dhaka, which is probably the fastest growing city in the world, which represents urbanism in extremis. With a population now north of 17 million, it isn't simply sprawling, it is densifying insanely, with over 115,000 people crammed into every square mile. Mumbai is more than 30% less dense. Hong Kong, 33%, Manhattan, 40%, and the greater New York conurbation at least 90% less dense. In Dhaka, as elsewhere, the greatest densities are, of course, in the slums. And I've just seen an estimate that some of these reach a seemingly impossible 2.5 million per square mile. That's 4,200 per acre. This is unbelievable. Of course, urban density has to be seen with some nuance. Obviously, a collection of well-heeled people living large in a glittering New York high-rise will have a different relationship to the idea of density than a comparable number packed into a fetid chawl in Mumbai. We're a little out of sequence. That is not the fetid chawl. Depending on both its constituents and its opportunities, a crowd assumes very different qualities in different contexts. A Parisian boulevardier experiences 100 people in near proximity as fascinating, while a child lost in a dark alleyway in Jakarta or Newark will have a very different feeling. How to set limits. There's another graphic in current circulation, paralleling in its way the famous pessimistic 4 planets, depicting the allegedly liberating claim that all of the world's city dwellers would fit into Texas if the entire state were simply built at New York City densities. But what does this proposition actually mean? All of Texas could fit into Manhattan at Kowloon densities, an even more horrific prospect. Not to mention that if we were all to become Texans, Rick Perry and Ted Cruz would rule the world. The point is to use space wisely. Density marks a distributive choice, not simply a goal. We've long recognized the special logics of sustainability and sociability that cities uniquely deliver. And one of the components that enables this is density, up to a point. But although both size and density ramify in many directions, they do not fully come to grips with the most enormous problem we confront, the grotesque gap between rich and poor, that oft-told tale of two cities. Today, the average price of an apartment in Manhattan is over $1 million. And globe-trotting plutocrats seem to think nothing of parking $100 million on our rising billionaires' row, super tall buildings lording it over the city like San Gimignano on steroids. At the same time, as a recent study reveals, a person employed at the current US minimum wage cannot afford an apartment anywhere in the city of New York. Sadly, our own architectural creativity is too much dedicated to this 1% of the 1%, and too many of our starchitects are content to simply monumentalize the income gap. Sustainability is a fundamentally political question, and for many, green has become the new red. But like those uncritical claims for density, sustainability is too often used to obfuscate the question of inequality. The danger of many developing countries, the anger, of many developing countries at having this universal value piously shoved down their throats by governments that have spent 2 centuries dumping carbon into the air and stripping resources from their colonies is understandable and critical. Our pieties about LEED platinum ratings are surely meaningless to that 1 in 7 who must survive on an income of less than $1.25 a day. This crisis is not simply about rich nations and poor, but reproduces itself internally and rampantly within both developing and developed economies. According to a widely circulated 2014 report from Credit Suisse, Russia having abandoned its former egalitarian ideals, now has the world's highest rate of inequality. The top 10% of Russians own 85% of the country's wealth. Turkey, of all places, comes in second at 77.7. The US at 74.6 is way down at number 7, just behind Thailand's 75% and just above India's 74%. And congratulations to all of you on the relatively egalitarian ownership of a mere 54.1% of your national wealth by the top 10%. Strikingly, however, do you think I look like the leader of the Labour Party? I've been told this at least twice. Strikingly, however, national calculations of ecological footprints often yield a very different hierarchy than measures of inequality, like the Gini coefficient. Here, for example, despite their comparable concentrations of wealth in the top 10%, the US and India are not even remotely close. The average American ecological footprint is about 6.8 hectares per capita, while the average Indian only needs 0.9. How to interpret this? One way is to describe Americans as piggish usurpers and Indians as model environmental citizens. This is true to a degree. Any resolution of the twin problems of deprivation and inequality must take place on both supply, where America excels, and demand, where Indians outperform sides of the equation. But neither starvation nor gluttony is the answer, and Americans must learn to live more like Indians if Indians are to have the opportunity to live more like Americans. This isn't simply an efficiency problem, a condition that could be cured by political strategies for sharing existing wealth and its styles of production. Nor can we count on technology, another green revolution, cheap desalination, lean manufacture, industrialized building, to continuously unlock the Earth's potential. Looked at within their national borders, both Americans, despite enormous productivity, and Indians, despite pervasive austerity, produce dramatic deficits in terms of their total national biocapacities, the combined measure of both the possible levels of production of biological materials on land and water, and of the ability of the collective ecosystem to deal with the wastes it generates, such as carbon dioxide and sewage. The current biocapacity of the US is about 3.6 hectares per capita, which yields a shortfall of 3.1 for each of us. In India, biocapacity is only half a hectare per capita, with a resulting deficit of about 0.4. The US is 3 times the size of India, but there are 5 times as many Indians as Americans, which means the aggregated deficit of the US is merely twice that of India. The huge actual discrepancy between the two countries is thus to be found both in dramatically different individual rates of consumption and in the range of resources available to deal with supplying these needs and desires. One thing that's clear, though, is that as a global matter, there's much more elasticity on the demand side than there is on that of supply. Earth's bearing capacity is finite, and our architecture and urbanism urgently need to recognize this and to respond. What then, as the man said, is to be done? It's not true that the great Satan has produced nothing of value. And more relevantly, how can cities help? We all know the wise bromide, think globally, act locally. This formulation, if not the phrase itself, is often attributed to that fascinating character. Oh, we're way out of sequence. Or are we? No, to that fascinating character, Patrick Geddes. Geddes, as you know, was a Scottish biologist and city planner who pioneered the understanding of the relationship of cities and what we now call the environment. His great contribution was in articulating the idea of an idea of the local that was embedded in the specifics of region, a recursive notion that he made graphically clear in his famous image of the valley section. Geddes, I think, has special relevance, not simply for clarifying the dimensions of our environmental crisis, but for identifying a broader issue of cultural identity embedded in our relationship to place. At the very beginning of the 20th century, he saw a growing rupture between culture and authenticity, a problem we recognize both in the inevitability that wherever we visit, we stay in the Ibis, Novotel, Hilton, Holiday Inn, thank you very much, Lindsay, or Radisson, and more darkly, in the murderous behavior of those who seek to secure their own identities by expunging the people, practices, even the physical remains of cultures they revile. I believe we must both renew existing cities and build new ones, and lots of them. One of the bugaboos of the politically correct, however, is the master plan. Stinking of patriarchy, authoritarianism, insensitivity, and the hubris of every kind of overreach, this territory of expressive inquiry is simply too suspect. We often look at representations of new cities and quarters in their all at once as a kind of pornography, the gaze that maligns and entraps. For many years, these representations have often come in a kind of protective dystopian wrapper, reinforcing the idea that the visionary is evil by definition. I've been teaching urban design for quite a long time, and I've often asked my students to make images of ideal cities. There was a long and troubling period where a large percentage brought in, on the first day of class admittedly, a still image from Blade Runner, The Fifth Element, or Tomorrowland, images of undeniable graphic power, but sinister meaning. I, however, grew up on a sunnier vision of utopia, and the idea of the new town, conceived in the all at once, has always been on my mind. My very first architectural model, sometime in grade school, was of Brasilia. Unable to think of another way of constructing a dome, I used a half grapefruit for the Congress Hall, an obvious early example of my deep commitment to green architecture. I pawed repeatedly through Mumford's City in History to get to the plates with the images of that prototypical Swedish new town, Vällingby. Later, I actually visited. I spent 6 months on a kibbutz. My childhood was passed in an idyllic modernist suburb of the formidably planned Washington, D.C. I was a volunteer at that great temporary intentional community, Resurrection City. I did miss Woodstock. The guy said to me, "You want to go to a music festival this weekend?" And I said, "Nah, I think I'm going to sleep in." God damn it. But was certainly part of the nation of its fellow travelers, simultaneously immersed in the spatial politics of both the out there and the ameliorative. I worked as an advocacy planner and a minor municipal official. I was a squatter in Earl's Court for a time. I was equally stimulated by Archigram and Jane Jacobs, and still am. I see no contradiction. Both styles of thinking are deeply relevant, and true ecological imagination always suggests expansiveness and inclusion. I'm not trying to take a moderate position here to split the difference. I want to argue that work on the city can begin anywhere where some heart and mind-felt certainty is found. I believe that neither the dominant deductive style of planning, we begin with a general program, proceed to a morphological frame, and finally get down to designing the doorknobs, nor the more open-ended inductive style, start with a memory of a sunny day in Venice or Cartagena, or with some form that insistently insinuates itself into your sketchbook. Neither of these is enough. The process must be dialectical, mutually interrogatory, a framework that applies not simply to questions of scale and direction, but also to styles of participation. equity demands the most varied and fluid forms of both imagination and of representation. Our cities, new and old, must address the triple crisis of a degrading environment, rampant inequality, and threatened cultural difference. Because of their scale, ecological complexity, productive capacity, relative autonomy, and expressive singularity, cities are especially powerful and tractable increments for social and environmental accountancy, organization, and empowerment. One of the things powerfully revealed in the huge discrepancy and variation between income equality and footprint size is precisely that nation states are not the most competent actors in addressing this dire situation. Witness only the horrors of today, the tsunami of mass migration as millions flee sites of poverty, warfare, and hopelessness towards the magnetic attractions of places of prosperity and stability. This result of the enormous global mismatch between biocapacity and social capacity is something we simply have not been able to work out at the national level. Whether it's the raw economic colonialism of the Chinese as they buy up farmland in Africa or minerals in Australia, the free trade nostrums of the multinational economy in which capital flows to sites of maximum exploitation, or the fundamental inability of so many states to provide people with the minimum necessities of life, the system is indifferent to the actual limits to growth, to coin a phrase. Lebensraum is a zero-sum game. For many years, now finally we get to the architecture. For many years, my studio has been trying to imagine and design cities and their elements that are harmonized, localized, bounded, founded in neighborhoods, and mixed. It's especially critical to think radically about mix. And the most difficult and critical task for urban planning, design, and governance is to artfully and equitably finesse and nurture the mixtures of people and activities in place and to provide for them. In our vision of the good neighborhood, we seek to maximize autonomy, including both social life and basic respiration. In this view, a successful neighborhood is both highly sustainable environmentally and a place in which all the necessities of daily life, work, recreation, education, commerce, culture, etc., are available within an easy walking compass of home. Most planners pay lip service to this idea, but not to its fullest implication. If everyone in the neighborhood can walk to work, everyone who works in the neighborhood must also be able to live there. The banker and the barista, the teacher and the student, the janitor, the artist, and the electrician. This simple principle has fairly radical implications. So now I'm going to show you, you see, it's only been half an hour, and I'm right on schedule, so don't worry. I'm going to show you three projects, one from 1994, one from 2010, and one still ongoing. These occupy different conceptual spaces, but all deal with questions of urban autonomy. In two cases, via the creation of new cities or quarters, the first fantastical, the second more conventional, and in the third through the retrofit of an existing city. All are projects that are represented in a projective all at once, which I think is indispensable as stimulus and as propaganda for possibility. Of course, we are effectively creating new cities all the time. China is doing it in the old-fashioned way, finding empty sites, constructing massively, planning a long march of urbanization that will move 250 million people into towns in the next 10 years. Such accelerated single-form construction has historically been typical in the US too, where suburban sprawl and its current reformulation as the edge city have created new patterns of movement and distribution of uses, but little change in density, inefficiency, or alienation. However, that the future of the city is unpredictable should not discourage us from speculation about the right now. Too much contingency yields an oppressive uncertainty. Too little simply imprisons. WEED is a project for the design of a new city on a small part of an existing military base near Yuma, Arizona. Sited on an artificial lake on the lower Colorado River and adjoining abundant agricultural land, WEED embodies a set of motherhood issues that characterize all our work on city design and are the bedrock of sustainable urbanism in general. To begin, the town is car-free. Vehicles relegated to the periphery with benign means, walking the inevitable alpha used for internal circulation. To enable this, the town is strictly bounded, edges fixed. Its structure is based on a series of neighborhood-scaled increments based on a 10-minute walking radius, or 20 minutes from the edge of the desert to the edge of the water, that locates both centers and other distributed facilities and public spaces, a basic unit of accountancy for complete neighborhoods. Beyond that, the organization is, to put it mildly, complex, and enables, among other things, one of the salient opportunities of the good urban life: getting lost. Despite their somewhat wild appearance, the drawings for WEED are meant to be read as precisely as possible and are in fact drawn to scale. The map of differences is authoritative, suggesting both size and variety. Thus, while we don't specify what the meaning of the differing shades of blue or green might be, ornamental garden, constructed wetland, picnic grounds, swimming hole, fish farm, we do propose a highly particular density of difference. It should be clear that the remix of green, blue, and built spaces represents a fairly radical divergence with contemporary practice, dramatically skewed greenish. The architecture may be strangish, but it's also meant to be pretty precise. WEED is imagined as a loft based on a kind of architectural stem cell, space without assigned use but ready to assume any. This is not exactly far-fetched. The discourse of flexibility and what used to be called equipotentiality, you remember that from school days, right? Has been a staple of modernist fantasies about architecture, and the experience of the post-industrial city has shown increasing possibilities for an adaptable, dramatically mixed distribution of uses. The loft idea that arose in the 60s and 70s combined two distinct, if related, streams. The first was the more ideologically driven idea of flexibility that found its most dramatic expression in buildings like the Pompidou Center, with its fantasy of subdivision, the idea that from a very large and essentially undefined space, with services near at hand, a variety of more bespoke environments could be carved. This paralleled the discovery of loft living in abandoned urban industrial zones, classically Soho in New York City, where the occupation of former factories became a kind of beau ideal for the artistic life, rife with implications of freedom, abundance, and the recovery of the righteous vibe of a vanished industrial class. This anything possible condition is also vividly present in informal settlements, both in the intensity of their mix and in the extreme adaptability of their simply built structures. In both Paris and New York, though, architectures that appeared flexible proved rigid and far less tractable than touted. In the case of enormous buildings like the Beaubourg, not to mention the giant floor-plated office buildings still typical of corporate America, the very vastness of the space and the long distances to its day-lit perimeter were efficient only according to a soulless bureaucratic model. Likewise, the much smaller lofts of Soho were constrained by the limitations of their original construction. Party wall buildings with decent light at one end and not much more than an air shaft at the other, they worked well unsubdivided, but failed when their action painter inhabitants spawned offspring and required private spaces, extremely difficult to provide with light and air. Weed, with its highly formalized informality, investigates an idea about lofts that are differentiated through aggregation rather than subdivision. The idea is that spaces can be more particular, more individual, if the medium from which they are produced is complex and resistant and provokes unexpected opportunities. Still, these spaces of unspecified use but open potential can be designed with fairly exact characteristics. One of the arguments of the project is that architecture and the city itself find their basic forms and sizes in relationship to the fundamental needs of the body and of sustainability. Human dimensions and their environmental requirements are not exactly obscure. We conduct our activities face to face, and our spatial needs and habits of both gathering and isolation have been developed down the millennia. Buildings designed for daylight and cross-ventilation, the bedrock of sustainable architecture, will tend to fall within a narrow range of lengths and widths, and the drawings for weeds speculate about a number of configurations for flexible and sustainable, yet resistant and complex forms of inhabitation. This includes both plan and section. In a city organized around the primacy of human locomotion, buildings will tend, as they were from the dawn of architecture to the end of the 19th century, to be low and accessible by foot power. In general, this means a default maximum of around 5 stories. Having spent, myself, 26 years living on the top floor of a 5-story walk-up building, I can verify to you that extensive empirical research reveals that this is pretty much the upper limit for the regular climbing of stairs by middle-aged Americans, at any rate. The body-based sustainable city will thus tend to be both dense and low. So much about the fundamental physical requirements of such a city is easily derived. It's possible to offer a very wide variety of solutions to its design based simply on common sense, a logic that simultaneously tests form, use, and respiration. While weed has specialized districts, like this concentration of theaters and assembly halls, this notion that a city can be designed in some detail without precise programming and zoning is something we continue to investigate. Zoning is an artifact of the 19th century, a product of the rise of the industrial city. Although cities have always been zoned in the isolation of royal or sacred quarters, or the communal flourishing of the districts of guilds or crafts, the creation of enormous classes of activities and people considered to be obnoxious is a result of the ecology of industrial capitalism. Smoke-belching factories, fatal rail lines, and restive concentrations of the working class had to be managed spatially for both efficient production and policing. Our cities remain slaves of these tactics and their specific architectures, infrastructures, and social and spatial relations. Weed, like much of our work, investigates the morphological implications of a newly liberated situation, one in which zoning is losing its primary rationale. The twin imperatives of keeping foul uses and dangerous classes in isolation are now being undercut by the prospect of clean production, service-oriented urban economies, tolerance for the presence of the other, and a growing recognition of the decisive role cities play in planetary ecology. Now, weeds' forms may be somewhat eccentric, but many of these places are designed recollectively, mixing memory and invention as all architecture must. The spaces are meant to evoke in proportion, dimension, materiality, or feeling some touchstone for successful placemaking. Well, you may not precisely feel the souks of Fez, the Piazza Navona, or the canals of Suzhou. They've registered indelibly on me as places of pleasure, practicality, and harmony, and are my own instruments of measure. The design of locality must always begin with living cultures and habits, vital connections between urban form and lives as people want to lead them. Ecological cities will be irresistibly shaped by this vitality and by the specifics of their bioclimatic and topographical situations. Refusing the paradigm of sealed, uniform, space capsule architecture predicated on a fundamentally paranoid reading of the environment as the source of discomfort and toxic dread, whether from ISIS, MERS, or a billion tailpipes. Weed also offers an argument for another source of particularity, artistic invention. As local cultures find themselves under increasing duress, originalities of vision must play an increasingly important role. This doesn't mean that every city must be wild and crazy, but it does suggest an unusually liberated situation, that the relationship between freshness and consent is open to new approaches that ally to resist a universalized architecture and human subjectivity. A consumer of Starbucks and McDonald's, where distinction is produced only by the most trivial inflection. Art resists by offering range. One weed might very well be delightful. A world of them would, I suspect, be a complete nightmare. So the urban work that we've been doing seeks to reinstigate the idea of boundedness in light of the demands of sustainability. This is based on a strategy of what we've been calling radical harmonization, the outcome both of ideas about bearing capacity, literal levels of local sustainability, and by extension about political and economic strategies that flirt with the idea of autarky. Of course, I don't reject the economics of comparative advantage, and no, we must not retreat behind walls of privilege, indifference, or hostility. Still, I believe that our duty as citizens involves taking direct responsibility for our individual roles in the fate of the earth, and that this demands radical, cooperative self-reliance. Cities, both metaphorically and literally, must therefore engage forms of local protectionism to foster urban import substitution. This was a concept dear to America's most important urbanist, Jane Jacobs, who believed that this process, import substitution, actually originated cities, as well as a key and often successful formulation in post-war national development strategies that did have considerable success before succumbing to neoliberal repression. Also does have a little bit of an association with, let us say, Hitler and Kim Il-sung, but let's pass over that for the moment. The harmonization I have in mind goes beyond questions of protecting infant industries and other local productive capacity to a broader idea about closing environmental loops in key areas of urban respiration. Harmonization is the medium by which limits are set and regulated and locality is established and affirmed. It is also, and critically, a means to equity, a way for those of us who work in the built environment to internalize and advance ideas of justice. While it's folly to think that urban design can produce democracy or save the planet on its own, we shouldn't underestimate its power to advance both of these agendas. This dilemma is nowhere clearer than China. Say what you will about the results, the sheer rate of transformation is completely astonishing. Over the past few decades, hundreds of millions have been lifted from poverty into some version of the middle class, producing the greatest national migration from country to city in all of human history. Unfortunately, most of these people have been housed in cities planned on the basis of antique models, inherited first from the Soviets and more recently from us. In this design of a satellite city, competition winner, near Wuhan, we began with a declaration of the metrics for 8 specific harmonies we sought to achieve: air and climate, food, building, energy, movement, water, waste, and biodiversity. By the simple use of best practices, we sought to dramatically shrink its ecological footprint, which we did by 50%. The site for the town and its projected population of 400,000 lies at the southwest edge of the city in a largely untouched territory dominated by a lovely array of lakes with waters as yet little polluted. We first divided the site and concentrated construction on the east, adjacent to existing development, while retaining the west for the farming of food and energy, including solar, wind, and biomass, and providing an opening for the infiltration of existing green space. The basic organization of the project is polycentric, a series of semi-autonomous districts or neighborhoods, each seated with particular programmatic activity, in this case, administration, higher education, entertainment, and commerce. And each of these is large enough to satisfy both practical and notional requirements for everyday neighborhood and urban life as described before. All are joined by efficient public transportation, including trams and buses, and direct links to the city subway system. This new town is intended to be formally of a piece, with consistent gradients of density, a reliable and harmonized mix of uses and people, and tractable dimensions. The central, one behind, the transit system. The central commercial district was our main focus, and its outlines are determined by concentration of density away from the water, the relatively linear form of the site, an idea about maximizing built mass at the center with declining density towards the edges, the formation of potential neighborhoods in relation to transit, and an idea about a high level of mix throughout, of uses, architectures, people, and atmospheres. The design of individual buildings is both notional and specific, as we assume that good cities must be the product of many hands. And the buildings that I'm showing you here are drawn from various projects we've done of late around China. What we've drawn is meant to be volumetrically reliable. The translation of floor area ratio into a 3-dimensional envelope, and to set a mood. The same is, whoa, that one's not too bad. Shanghai. The same is true of the second big district we designed, which incorporates property already intended for an entertainment complex. The forms grow out of the same stable of basic ideas about scale, mix, and sustainability, as well as locality, but the particulars of the site yield a pattern that's sufficiently different from the sibling town just to the north. Distributed around the lakes are a series of water villages, miniature Sino-Portofinos, that offer another lifestyle opportunity and are linked by ferries. Finally, we suggested something of what the lowest site densities might look like, a low-rise morphology that might appear both as an edge condition or as an intermediate one, embedded in higher density areas. We suggested as well that there be a locally manufactured system of electric cars, both for travel beyond the site and to serve as a storage medium for the local energy farms. One more project with your indulgence. I'll take that to be a yes. For the past decade, Terraform, the non-profit, and I mean non-profit, research center I direct, has been engaged in a thought experiment that investigates the idea of urban harmonization at its outer limits. We've been working to find out what it would mean for New York City to literally take responsibility for all the elements required to sustain itself: food, waste, air, water, climate, construction, energy, and manufacture, not as an abstraction, but as a literal fact of daily life. The predicate of New York City's steady state is the test of complete self-sufficiency within the city's political boundaries. Our project looks at both the demand and supply sides of urban autonomy, and by pushing as far as we can, we're compiling an encyclopedia of morphologies, technologies, and human practices that will, we hope, be of widespread use around the world. We're motivated to do this by the conviction that independent city-states are utterly critical increments of organization and resistance in a globalizing and indifferent system, and that this work can be an invigorating source of both urban form and social justice. We began the project with a focus on food. Urban agriculture is a subject of much discussion these days and is obviously fundamental to survival, and it has the added appeal of a certain challenging improbability in the context of the densely built city. We're now almost done with this first volume of our larger study and have demonstrated that from a purely spatial standpoint, it's possible to produce enough food for 8.5 people to have at least 2,400 nutritious calories each day within the city. We've also discovered that the environmental, economical, political, cultural, culinary, and morphological arguments for doing this are complex and often defy practicality. This is a picture of a 30-story building the size of a New York City block, which can feed about 30,000 people, assuming you like bean sprouts. Our work has investigated sites for production at every scale, including buildings, transformed streets, repurposed infrastructure, existing open spaces, and vertical farms. This latter type, constructed in their thousands, would be, in fact, indispensable to full self-sufficiency in a built-out, bounded city like New York. However, such vertical systems require enormous investment, recast the skyline, are incapable of producing many foods in appropriate quantities, and can be radically impractical. The primary impediment to a genuinely sustainable system of vertical agriculture turns out to be not space so much, but the extremely high energy inputs needed for illumination and heating, as well as for the massive initial construction, including the energy embodied in their materials. Although enough of those 30-story agricultural towers, using a variety of advanced hydroponic, aeroponic, and other minimalist cultivation techniques, there they are, could be built to supply the city with food on about 2% of New York's total land area, a photovoltaic array sufficient to supply them would require an area 3.5 times the total surface of the city, about 750,000 acres. Alternatively, 25 nuclear power plants would do the job, but this did strike us as being somewhat contrary to the broader spirit of the exercise. Recognizing the impracticality of this arrangement, we've looked at a series of sweet spots that are more aligned with closing neighborhood-scaled loops, utilizing viable levels of energy, construction investment, and available land, and always honoring the rights of existing people and communities. We've investigated a variety of morphological transformations at every scale that would characterize a city committed to autonomy and to the idea that urban respiration begins locally. One of the speculations that we've pursued in doing this is a little out of sequence. This is the bad example. This is the 100% example of some blocks in Queens. One of the speculations we've pursued is the figure ground switch, in which the 19th century block pattern sees its built mass migrate into the space of the street, freeing the block interiors for agriculture and other public uses. In the first iteration, which we thought was utter genius, you can see here, This inversion was largely directed to questions of movement and of the public realm, to strategies for reconfiguring the ratio of public to private space in the city. We'd been looking for an outcome that would combine the modernist fantasy of living in greenery with a more historic idea of the central importance of the street. This new pattern is one in which urban circulation has already been radically transformed, with streets largely removed from the automobile system, and to a degree from any form of mechanical circulation, with a mix of pedestrians, bikes, trams, buses, and relatively few small, non-emitting vehicles, complete streets, as they're sometimes called. These were imagined as at once post-automotive and pre-modern, and a particular inspiration for us was the Islamic city. When we first tried this out, we saw it far too simply. In that initial sketch of a pure figure ground switch, the morphology is attractive, but the real potential for intensive food production is actually very small. We'd simply plunged in, devoting too little time to the actual metrics of sufficiency. We soon realized that even if we devoted all of the new terraced rooftops and interior courts to agriculture, the harvest was insufficient to feed more than 2 or 3% of the encompassed population. A more detailed investigation of several blocks in Sunnyside, Queens, revealed the dilemmas with greater precision. We looked at this transformation with a basic assumption. As I said, the population of the blocks under study must remain constant, and the area of calculation would not exceed the dimensions of the streets and blocks under combination. We first tested a 100% scheme, which was what was in that first perspective. And as you may recall, the result did have a somewhat stimulating Kowloon-like urban flavor. But the vertical farms present their usual problems. The density of the towers compromises efficient solar access at lower levels, which means that energy inputs for artificial illumination are substantially increased. One solution is to employ the lower portions of the towers for some other uses. Another is to have fewer towers. Both reduce on-site capacity to grow food. A tower. We finally settled on a scheme to produce 30% of the food requirement on the site, which yielded a more gracious proposition and became a kind of general benchmark for the project. The nature of the steady-state economy reveals itself in this sort of calculation. Adding residential units to the site means that housing could be subtracted elsewhere in the city. This, I think, is useful in reconsidering parts of New York that are built at suburban densities, a pox on Staten Island, and still heavily dependent on cars. Energy, however, isn't entirely fungible. It's tied to the site of its thermodynamic conversion, whether in a car, an air conditioner, or a light bulb. Using additional energy to up food production has implications for citywide conservation and production strategies of other things. And if most of the food is coming from off-site, this ramifies in bigger strategies for provisioning the city as a whole. In the Queens case, the switched blocks are adjacent to one of the very large vertical farm complexes we're proposing above the huge existing Sunnyside rail yards, which is near enough to be part of any local aggregation and disaggregation scheme. In the same spirit, of course, the area might be used for solar arrays to power the vertical farms or simply to plug into the increasingly autonomous city electrical grid. We've looked at many specific architectures and solutions and have designed prototype vertical farms for both crop and animal production, various smaller scale greenhouses, wall systems, and other elements of what is now a fairly well-developed repertoire of agrarian resources. We've looked at the way these structures and techniques can be integrated into the fabric of the city, and have been particularly interested in the reclaiming of the space of the street from an automobile-dominated movement culture for a broader mix of public uses, including such immobile examples as agriculture. We've looked at all scales, from window boxes to skyscrapers, in order to suggest a system in which production is not monopolized by the urban equivalent of agribusiness, something this whole project implicitly attempts to critique. And we're perfectly aware of how tempting a target millions of square feet of municipally developed, automated vertical farms would be for Archer's, Daniels, Midland, or Monsanto. We've now investigated scenarios for reconfiguring the city as a whole to allow it, as I said, to grow 100% of its food supply, to help tease out what will be genuinely new in the organization of radically sustainable cities in general. The main means of production include large areas of vertical farms, particularly in portions of the city that are currently built at suburban densities, figure ground switches, overbuilding of highway and rail infrastructures, and intensive utilization of rooftops, vacant lots, brownfields, and other available spaces. However, our larger reimagining of the city is based on an intensification of neighborhood autonomy. Our objective is to scale self-reliance down whenever possible, and a strong preference for local accountability in all aspects of urban respiration, from energy to sewage. Our drawings of New York reorganized are diagrammatic. We don't imagine a literal circular morphology for these transformed neighborhoods, but we do intend their recalibration on the basis of walk time and the emergence of a green supergrid as a zone of circulation, agriculture, climate control, recreation, water management, and organization. We are also in the process of designing a repurposed subway system to facilitate not simply the movement of people, but of goods. And we're looking at larger scaled sweet spots that have studied that scheme for 30% production of food within the city, a scheme for a 100-mile agricultural radius, and another for a statewide system that would use a fantastic piece of abandoned 19th century infrastructure, the Erie Canal. With some luck and a little help from our friends, we hope to finish this project, maybe in the next 5 years, and to offer the results to citizens and cities around the world that seek to preserve, enhance, and to share what that incredibly hip Pope Francis has eloquently called our common home. Thank you. Right on time.
Yeah, you can.
Thank you so much on behalf of the department and the faculty. On these occasions, there's meant to be a formal, there's meant to be some sort of formal response or the like, and I don't think anyone particularly wants to hear that, but I'm going to say a couple of things. Just to give you a chance to drink your Coke, and I'm sorry we couldn't get Pepsi.
No.
Welcome to the small eye.
thing.
It's the real thing. Okay, it's good. We can go to the pub later. Anyway, just to catch your breath, and then let the roving mic go round, and people can ask questions, if that's okay. Are you up for questions?
Sure, of course.
Good. Okay. So, I mean, I just wanted to say thank you again, and things I particularly enjoyed in it that came. One was the kind of beginning with the critique, and I kind of liked the nailing of the way that people tend to singularize things about cities, and I'm very conscious about how we tend to reduce everything visually, and equally other people have a kind of tendency to numerize things. When I say we, I suppose I'm talking about architects. We try and make everything visual, slightly acute, and then kind of grab hold of it. And I think one of the things that was really lovely about the lecture is that it kind of restated things being complex and made the point that nobody is innocent and nothing out there is innocent, and we can't behave as though people are, what we do is innocent and what we're acting upon and acting with is innocent. Everything is complicated. I don't think it's difficult. I think it's incredibly complicated. And I think this was a really strong reminder. When I say it's not difficult because it's so obvious. The scale of the task is so blindingly obvious. I don't think it's difficult, but I think it's hugely complex. And how to deal with that complexity is through what a lot of the things that you talked about, negotiation, and really beginning to work tactically in a slightly more clever way than perhaps we have in the past. And I just thought there were some of the things that came out of that you kind of said about negotiation, about working in a dialectic way were important. And then sort of ending with these projects, which I just thought were great and a kind of real fillip at the end of a long day. I thought they brought in some other kind of characteristics that weren't things you said. One was just generosity. And that seems to be a hugely important part of what we do. Quite rightly at the beginning, you were rather disparaging about the creative industries, and I'm deeply aware that the most unimaginative people work in the creative industries, and the dullest people can be creative, and you don't really want it. It's become a bit of a mantra. But part of being creative seems to me about believing in the power of suggestion, not as an arrogant statement, but just that, a generous suggestion. And I think underlying the generosity is a real characteristic about the projects is there seem to be a lot of issues about productivity, about shifting the city from being a place of consumption to a place of really imaginative consumption. So I thought they were rather wonderful. So that's my little moment to let you get your breath back.
Thank you.
You're going to have to come stand back up here now. Okay. And meanwhile, the mic is going to rove. So Sean's got his hand up.
Hello, Michael. Last time we met was about 15 years ago on the mountainside that inspired Nietzsche to write Thus Spake Zarathustra. So I liked your comments about the creative industries because I seem to remember our colleagues on that day were more concerned with who was going to take over as dean at the University of Columbia than being interested in the astonishing landscapes around them. And I'm glad to say you were an exception to that group.
Nor did I become dean.
You were lucky. It was a lucky escape.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask where you think politics sits with all this, because I think you would find that in terms of the ideas that the audience in here is likely to be sympathetic to the views you've put forward and will have enjoyed the ideas. But as you also pointed out, we live in a time of neoliberal global economics. And for example, we have similar things going on here in London that you will be familiar with in New York. Kind of little eco cultures in formerly derelict places. At the moment, there's a lot going on in South London in areas called Peckham, where fabulous little artistic communities have grown up alongside an incredibly vital urban scene, largely driven by immigration. And of course, it's all going to be fucked up because it's going to be gentrified. So that the kind of political forces are going to kind of overcode all of this fabulous stuff. My worry about your proposal is that it looks great, but how do you defeat the sources of what you called the Great Satan?
The easy question first. I hope that I was articulate enough to suggest that everything about that lecture is pervaded by the political. There are a couple of arguments that I think are crucial in terms of the defeat of the great Satan. And the first of them is the argument about the city being a logical increment of organization and resistance to the powers of the great Satan. So rather than abandoning our fate to the tender mercies of either the nation state or of the multinationals, I think it's important that we organize locally. Again, the bromide is where I stand. I think neighborhoods are a particularly critical source of political organization, and that simply doing the accountancy on a local level focuses the problem with what I believe is great clarity. There was also embedded in the lecture an argument about the nature of the neighborhood and an idea about completeness. Everybody talks about transit-oriented development or the 20-minute walking radius, but as I said, nobody actually seems to pursue the real implication of that, which is that a class-segregated neighborhood does not work in the context of any kind of idea of programmatic completeness. There's proposition number 2 or 3. And of course, from the standpoint of images, one of the reasons that we produce images is that I believe strongly in the importance of propaganda. So some of the propaganda is propaganda by image, some of it is propaganda by calculation, and some of it is propaganda by the argument that goes slightly but not exceedingly far. So I am not so, when I talk about the creative class, I'm referring, of course, to this Richard Florida idea about creative classes being the engine for urban development and growth, by which he precisely means gentrification. I don't know, I guess I'm a gentrifier at this point, although by God, at my age, I've earned it. Yeah, sure. I think that was a fairly politically conceived lecture. And as I say, art can also be constitutive of a form of resistance. So, we're always talking about the right to the city. This is. Are we not all in a right to the city reading group somehow? This Lefebvrean notion, and this is an important concept, obviously. Although I think too often thought simply in terms of ideas about access and the availability of all parts of the city to all of its citizens. Whereas I think the genius part of the notion is that the right to the city must include the right to imagine, work towards, and to achieve the city of which one dreams. I think that's our responsibility as social designers, is to think about the characteristics of those expanded possibilities, and then to make the metrics work, to demonstrate that this actually could happen if we want it. I'm sorry, is that too hippie and flaky and Woodstocky? I'm kind of in that frame of mind tonight.
You can't help your age.
Yeah, it's that mountainside, the wind blowing through my Nietzschean hair.
Hello, I'd really like to thank you for your lecture, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I hope that we're going to get a copy of the slides, or it will be more publicly available, because I'd like my students to see it. But all the while you were talking, and I kept thinking about the other sort of strand of American thought that keeps coming up in our readings, and I wonder I can imagine what you might think of it, but I'd really like to hear it from you, is the Congress of New Urbanism, and how you see that whole movement within America, and of course now it's spread globally as well.
Yeah, Prince, what's his name, is kind of fellow traveling member. Huh? You know, it's both an easy and a difficult question to answer. You know, on the one hand, have I not written 25 articles calling them, you know, fascist pigs? On the other hand, a true regard of what they do and have to say does require a little bit of nuance. And in fact, I think it's important to recognize that within this kind of camp of the new urbanists, there are factions. There has historically been a more interesting, more environmentally oriented kind of West Coast contingent, which is the source of ideas about transit-oriented development, the introduction of environmental characteristics into construction. There is a kind of somewhat problematic anti-suburban vector within the kind of Congress of New Urbanism, but we revile them for the class uniformity of their constructions, for the fact that they have not actually managed to either fully articulate or to build an authentically mixed community. All their work seems to be commuter suburbs for the white upper middle class. But you know, in my old age, I recognize that in some of their propositions there is some value. As a general matter, they are so closely identified with the politics of the right, with a kind of rehabilitation of suburbanism that, you know, is that enough wailing? I mean, they seem like, from my perspective, you know, it seems like a dead horse to me. But you know, one cannot dismiss out of hand every articulation that anybody associated. So, you know, for example, the more enlightened members of the CNU these days are looking at, you know, the way in which some suburbs can be densified, for example, around transit. This is not a completely unreasonable idea, but as I say, yeah, you know, they're a pack of fascists, and the hell with them. Is that the answer you would prefer? Okay, good. Take that, Andres Duani, you gusano pig. But I mean, you know, everybody's struggling over the legacy of Jane Jacobs. So that went through a couple of iterations. You know, first there was Jane Jacobs, the community activist, and the anti Robert Moses. You know, the avatar of the complex, balletic, sort of mixed community of reasonable scale and of complexity. But she's also somebody that they've tried to kind of arrogate to their armamentarium. So, you know, it's complicated. You know, even Donald Trump came out for universal health care in the course of his campaign, but somehow, you know, on balance, he's an evil motherfucker, you know what?
You talked about the distinction between urbanity and the city, and I'm just interested in sort of exploring that in terms of is urbanity, for example, something, or is the city, for example, something that can't necessarily be designed but worked with only, whereas urbanity is kind of building, and when you talk about the qualities of the city, such as accessibility and diversity and sort of complexity, are those things that can be designed, or are they things that have to exist in a city sort of organically, and that we need to work with them rather than try and replicate them.
Yeah, one of the things that we're obliged to confront is the actual scale of the problem that we're dealing with, which is to say that the rate of urbanization of the planet is, at this point, over 1 million people a week, which means that simply kind of finessing the character of existing cities is insufficient. Certainly, one can see existing towns and villages and cities as the irritant that finds its way into the oyster and ultimately produces the pearl of Paris. But I really think that the situation is not tractable unless we, either stop fucking or build a lot of new cities. Cities are cumulative works of collective art and thought. Formulating a strategy that simply leads to paralysis when confronting a green field, that doesn't work. Nor, I believe, is the idea that those forms of current urbanization, in particular megacities. I think a city over 10 million is, by definition, in most cases, ungovernable, apraxic, unsustainable. So alternatives must be sought, and among those alternatives, I'm not shy about designing new towns. We've done plenty. I don't imagine that they are built in green fields and remain static, that they acquire the patina of successive inhabitation, that ideas change, that cities are modified. This is their genius. There are places that we've been occupying for 2,000 years. Many of them just get better and better. Again, this is there are certain forms of part of the lecture was a kind of oblique attempt to rehabilitate the idea that something like master planning is possible. There are good ways to plan at the large scale and bad. I hope I suggested some avenues in the direction of better ways of thinking at a scale that's commensurate with the problem. One of them that I think is vital is that cities take responsibility for themselves, particularly given the levels of planetary inequality. For a city like London or New York, this has to happen in a radical fashion, or else we're still the colonialists we were. Can we have a drink now?
I think we should wrap it up and thank the leader of the Labour Party for taking his time off his busy schedule. Thank you very much.